You are listening to Talking Star Wars. Well, I'm Connor.
And I'm Alex.
And we're going to talk about Star Wars.
Yeah, so today our topic, we would like to look at the intersection of genre in Star Wars.
Yes.
And specifically on Star Wars is, of course, at its base level, science fiction, but it incorporates many genres into it. And today we're going to look at the ways in which Western tropes, ideas, and sort of the aesthetic and vibe of a Western story sort of permeate Star Wars both from the beginning and its more modern revisiting of those roots after having it become less important in sort of the prequel era. So, Connor, why don't you take us off by going over what Western feels like? It's a very
Sure.
U.S. sort of thing. And
I'd like to focus, at least for right now, on A New Hope, just because that movie establishes all of the different genres that Star Wars is going to delve into. But in terms of its Western ideals there, the character of Han Solo comes up right away.
we should establish what we feel like a Western is.
Oh,
So,
sure.
yeah, what
Well, that's my answer. Western is Han Solo. It's an attitude. It's an attitude, and it's also being sort of on the edge of society. When I think of a Western, I don't think of very clean and happy things. I think of outlaws. I think of scoundrels. I think of people who are just on the ropes trying to get by.
Yeah, so there are several defining characteristics of the Western genre.
Sand. There's also sand.
Yeah, these desolate environments in distant places that are not usually controlled by law. If the law is there, they're either ineffective, run by one person, or are a distant force that could be called in as an enormous hammer, but they're not there to handle with the day to day.
Yeah.
So there's a focus on these individual characters and choices. There's the sense of isolation. There's the brutality of violence always seems possible. And there's this rising tension between individuals and what they do when unbound by social mores in a far distant land.
When you mention violence, it brings to mind the shootout that we get in Star Wars between Han Solo and Greedo. And no matter who shot first, it's still this, we're going to settle our differences with some gunplay. And despite the fact that moment had so much argument over it to try to soften Han Solo's visage, no one seems to have any problem with Obi-Wan Kenobi behanding an alien moments prior. That's, there's no Obi-Wan /first movement due to some changes they made.
Yeah, well,
It's an explosive, violent time where even our wizardly, kind, grandfatherly figure knows the rules of the West, or Tatooine in this instance.
yeah, Obi-Wan, as in the famous line, does tell Luke, this is the wretched hive of scum and villainy, which you could apply to fairly much any Western depicted town and any famous Western, be it Tombstone, Silverado. The town is the source of the money men, and the outlaws raid it for cash. And Star Wars doesn't go much for like the easy women and things like that, but it's definitely this seedy sort of feeling to it. And also these dramatic confrontations between ideological and goal opposed individuals, where usually one person ends up dead. And by the way, Connor, our official stance on this podcast is that Han Solo did shoot first. So I think there are a few Western aesthetics, scenes and things. And it obviously takes a lot of inspiration from the spaghetti westerns of the 60s and 70s. And it obviously takes a lot of inspiration from the spaghetti westerns of the 60s and 70s. And of the earlier westerns than that. And then the Western revival, I think, that happened later with Clint Eastwood and things, I think also influenced the later movies as well. So what are one Western story aspect of Western stories that you think is interesting to look at through the lens of Star Wars?
I'm going back to what you said about it's a very American and Italian vibe.
It was American first, and everyone else is like, oh, that's cool.
Yeah,
like,
and we can film that cheap in our Italian deserts. But I think about the conversation between Kenobi and Han, and I go back to Han Solo because he's the only one who seems to be speaking English in the Star Wars universe. In A New Hope, at least, because up until then we have droids and we have plans, and it's all of this language that's not so maybe applicable to our own lives, but then we see Han Solo and he's just talking plainly. He's talking about cutting a deal, so much up front, so much once we get there. His attitude is very American. He has no respect for the Empire, for the Force religion.
Yeah, I think we could say less American, but more Western. He is a Western protagonist who has stumbled his way in to a science fiction coming of age hero story. Mm-hmm. So he is noted by his cynicism of not believing in the Force, and he's got this heart of gold under a gruff exterior. He is motivated, at least first, primarily by money. There's crime, greed, banditry.
There's a slumlord that he owes money to, who he has a debt over his head from.
Yeah, so Han Solo, I think, is definitely the most Western part of A New Hope, and probably the original trilogy as a whole. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he's the person who always pulls a blaster first. There's also the scene in The Empire Strikes Back where the Dark Lord confronts you over dinner at Bespin, and the expected reaction is, okay, you've realized you've been played. Now Han Solo pulls out his blaster and starts blasting away because he knows he's in a Western, and you got to shoot first to make sure that person. But unfortunately,
I don't care if it's Darth Vader. No one's tried pulling a blaster in Darth Vader before.
Yeah, but unfortunately, he's a Western protagonist at that point in an epic sci-fi story, and so is defeated. But he is true to his genre and his character in his attempt. That's why we love him for it.
So it's very clear in A New Hope what is Western. Han Solo as a character is Western. The whole entire setting of Tatooine is very Western in the Cantina, also Luke's farmstead, where he's pining for adventure. He's hoping for something greater in his life as he's looking at the twin sunset, and that is a very Western ideal. It's that's trying to seek something greater than the lot in life that he already has.
Yeah, I mean, the Sand People, the Tusken Raiders, are even filling the same narrative role that perhaps a Native American would fill in an old, cowboy movie where, they're the natives of the desert and they're dangerous to be around. Obviously the view has become less reductive than that in the modern times, but in the 70s when Star Wars came out, New Hope, it was definitely playing in that space. And much like, Native American characters are now much more human than they ever were in original, spaghetti westerns and things. We also have, in more recent media, Tuskens portrayed, as more individual and actual people, and the Book of Boba Fett specifically. Yeah. But then we're explored in other media as well. And you're certainly intended to believe that Anakin Skywalker is doing a terrible thing when he murders an entire Tusken village. Yeah. It's not like they are portrayed as non-humans just there to be killed. It's the start of his turn to darkness.
The women and children too.
Yeah, not a great look for you, Anakin. Padme, you should have broken up with him at that point.
Yeah, should have started that relationship. Honestly,
yeah, and at that point, it's also revenge is a very Western type of story too. And Anakin's, he's on his steed, his black speeder, his black steed through the desert in Attack of the Clones. And he struggles with himself, but the focus is on him and his personal martial prowess that he makes his mother dies in his arms. And so then he makes I would say it's also playing in this, Western genre space where then he chooses revenge and he kills a bunch of people rather brutally. Just like a morally questionable Western former protagonist turning antagonist might.
So I'm wondering, this sequence also takes place on Tatooine. It's easy to have that aesthetic, that desert aesthetic lend itself into a Western.
Well, I bet they shot Westerns in that same desert too.
Oh yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. But when we take a look at some of the later films in like the original trilogy and Empire, Return of the Jedi, do we have as heavy of an emphasis on a Western ideal? I would say in Empire it's focusing a lot more on fantasy and the training with a mentor.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the Western influence became less when you leave Tatooine, especially in the latter. I wouldn't say the latter half of A New Hope has much of a Western, which is why Star Wars just fades in and out of whatever genre it needs. It steals which pieces it needs.
It is a melting pot.
The second half of A New Hope is more a samurai movie than anything else. But we see these Western influences keep cropping up. So let's What are some? Let's look at one of the hallmarks
Mhm.
of the Western genre, and that would be the showdown,
Hmm.
the duel at high noon, between two gunslingers coming together. It's not.
Sure.
It's somewhere between a duel and a fight, and we see this happen several times
Mhm.
in the Clone Wars series, in the Mandalorian. We'll get to the Mandalorian again in a second,
Hmm.
which is one of those Western revivals I was
Yeah.
talking about.
Oh yeah.
But let's do a review of some showdowns that
Hmm.
show up in Star Wars that we think have a Western influence.
I would say the Empire Strikes Back showdown between Luke and Vader. It's all, I would say, based on revenge, because other than the fact that Yoda told Luke, "Hey, you gotta kill Darth Vader," it's also very much a personal desire that, you killed my friend Ben Kenobi, my master, my teacher, who got me out of this lot in life. So I think, there's definitely an undercurrent of revenge there.
Well,
It's very silent when they come face to face, like a typical showdown.
yeah, and then Luke even comes in with his blaster drawn, blasts a few goons. He's got his
Hmm.
sidekick R2D2 with him, and then he's separated to fight the his primary enemy by himself in a silent duel,
Hmm.
and then fades more. Then it takes that setup from a Western genre, and then we go more into like a fantasy duel.
Hmm.
But definitely the whole setup of the hero arrives, guns blazing, having ignored his mentor to go and fight the Black Knight, the desperado of Darth Vader. Certainly calling on the Western genre.
Yeah.
Another famous showdown, I think, more recently
Hmm.
would be Cad Bane and Boba Fett.
Oh, sure. That's a definite standoff.
Yeah, and then there's also Din Djarin and the bodyguard from the Mandalorian's episode The Jedi.
Yeah, Michael Biehn, that's the actor. He's a Terminator. He's a science fiction
Yeah,
classic.
so he's tries to fool Din Djarin by shooting with a blaster, and Din just quick draws on him and takes him down.
Hmm.
And then Din Djarin has several other. It almost sometimes feels like he's walking through the world of Red Dead Redemption, where
Hmm.
anyone will pull a blaster on him and he'll pull it faster. Or
Yeah.
if they pull it faster, he's wearing Beskar armor here. Because you
Hmm.
got to remember, we're not just in a Western here. Sometimes people have fancy space armor.
Yeah, his whistling crickets. What are those missiles called?
Uh,
Flying sparrows.
I believe they were called the Whistling Birds.
But it's not your typical, strictly guns. We have a fantastical fantasy story on top of this western.
Yeah. And then probably the most Western scene I can remember from recent media would be Book of Boba Fett, Cad Bane walking into Freetown. You see his black hat just cresting the horizon, because of course Cad Bane, as an antagonist, has a black hat.
Of course.
So it's the whole tension building up. There's the main road through the dusty desert town, and then they see the lonely figure in black on the horizon. The sheriff and deputy send everyone inside, and they go to confront this dangerous stranger themselves. The deputy is overconfident. The
Mhm.
sheriff knows the stranger is dangerous. And then, as part of their confrontation, the deputy tries to pull on Cad Bane and is just blasted to pieces. So then it comes down to this showdown between Cobb Vanth and Cad Bane. And as you expect in a Western of the second act, the sheriff is not faster on the draw than the dangerous, evil gunslinger, and is gunned down there in the street and barely survives. So that is probably that showdown and tension between Cad Bane and Cobb Vanth is probably one of the most Western moments we've had in Star Wars in quite some time.
Yeah, I would argue what you've said about having the Mandalorian serve as this Western revival. If I think of the sequel trilogy, there aren't so many callbacks to Westerns as there are callbacks to Star Wars making callbacks to Westerns. You have your Cantina scene redo. You have Jakku, which is Tatooine. It's mild adjustments on what's been done in the Star Wars formula.
Whereas I would call the Mandalorian much a return to drawing more on the direct original aesthetic influences of Star Wars. With the lone gunslinger. Yeah, the Mandalorian definitely has this more Western feeling of the lone gunslinger out on his own, trying to make his way, and then he has a child that travels with him.
And that's like the Lone Wolf and Cub Eastern story, and there's so much interplay back and forth, because if you take a look at I'm going to screw up the name, but it's the original Japanese films that George Lucas looked to, like Seven Samurai. That was adapted into The Magnificent Seven, which you have this, Eastern Samurai story being adapted into a Western Americanized story.
Telling almost the same story, because the cowboy is culturally filling a very similar role to the Ronin in westerns and samurai stories. They definitely are some overlap, which is why we'll definitely be talking more about westerns when we get to our episode about samurai and Eastern influences on Star Wars.
Yeah, it's interesting conversation back and forth between the culture.
There was even an episode of the Clone Wars, if you remember, that is basically a retelling of the Magnificent Seven, when the pirate band led by Hondo Ohnaka is attempting to extort a village of innocent bystanders. They have hired a group of local mercenaries to protect their town, who say they're only in it for the money, but really they're doing this at cost or far less because they can't stand to see the town be further harmed by these bandits. And then some Jedi show up to further even the scales. And it's sort of even a more lighthearted, but it is almost a direct, retelling. And then there's even the moment where we must train the villagers to protect themselves. And then at the pivotal moment, they will help us fight off these invaders.
Clone Wars had, I should say, such an excellent opportunity to take time for smaller moments and smaller stories that didn't just have to be part of the single hero's journey that Anakin Skywalker walks down, which, a movie needs to do that. A movie can't serve everything and all these characters, but I'm glad that there's room, like the Clone Wars, like Mandalorian, for creators to harken back to some of the original inspirations to Star Wars and continue on.
Yeah. So if we talked about some showdowns that have happened in Star Wars, taking either direct or indirect influence from Western films, there's this heavy frontier aspect where and I think the Outer Rim in Star Wars is certainly, it's almost like, if the Inner Rim is like, if you do a genre map of Star Wars, the further in you go, the more sci-fi you get. When you get to the Outer Rim, it's like, now we're in Western territory. They were on the frontier.
Uncharted and wily. Like, I think of, so it's strange, but all the episodes of The Mandalorian where he has to face off against some large, scary creature, or he has to wrangle the dragon. It's wrangle the dragon sounds like a fantasy trope, but it's also having to break the horse, or having to combat the mountain lion, or having to chase off the bear. It's very much person versus nature kind of stories, which Star Wars always has some slimy, creaturey thing that serves different plot purposes. Like Force Awakens, I don't know what the Rathtars offer to the overall experience, other than poorly aging CGI. But adventure.
All right. Well, we'll move on from Connor's distaste for the sequel trilogy, as you can see in other episodes, if you'd like to get more into that.
I'm going to do a supercut of all my complaints. That'll be a bonus episode.
So I think another Western trope that we can also talk about in Star Wars, which has some more recent fiction I want to talk about, is the heist. Is a cornerstone of the Western genre, of the morally questionable protagonists who are down on their luck and need money. And so then they are fighting against usually a faceless bank or institution. So you don't feel that bad about what they're doing. They're doing something wrong, but it's cool. And
or it's the empire they're stealing from, which that's always okay.
Well, yeah, and that's how Star Wars adapts that Western trope, because, it takes the faceless bank and makes them the empire. Or do we really care that the Republic is getting robbed, or the Separatists? So there's this heist narrative that often comes up. So let's talk about some heists that appear in Star Wars.
Well, let's talk about your favorite movie in the series, Solo.
That was the impetus for the subject. So Solo is basically, the second half of Solo is a heist movie. And it is probably the most, we haven't talked about it much yet, but it is one of the most Western inspired. Even going back to our talking about showdowns, there's the famous showdown between Han Solo and his mentor in that movie, Bias Beckett. So when the showdown between Han Solo and Beckett, which is a prequel, but is it also a deliberate callback to the original who shot first question with Greedo, and the director of that movie is obviously on our side, where Han should have shot first, because he just, before Beckett can get the drop on him,
Han gets the drop on Beckett.
Yeah, he just puts a shot in Beckett's chest, and Beckett's like, I trained you well. Yeah, and so that sort of gritty action, but action is definitely Western, and Han and Solo definitely is playing in a lot of other Western spaces, this sort of sleazy, grifting. You could even draw a lot of parallels between, I think, the famous movie Tombstone and Solo, where, with Lando, thinks he's Doc Holliday, but is not quite Doc Holliday. But he's dressed fancy. He's a quick shot. He's got a complicated relationship with a woman in his life.
You could say that.
Yeah. So, but going back to the heists that we were talking about. So Solo, the last half of that movie is entirely a heist where they're trying to steal the coaxium from...
Get it to another planet to refine it.
Yep, and then fight off other bandits that are trying to steal their haul. For whatever reason, there's still other bandits trying to steal their haul, ending in a final confrontation over the loot.
Ooh, and we also have, I think, our only instance of the femme fatale, which is kind of noir, shows up in westerns from time to time. But it's so this woman who has a past, has an agenda, and the hero is too blind to see that. So Han is very hopeful that he and his former love are going to ride away into the sunset, and she gets away with everything. She at least escapes, but I think she gets the monies, or some of it at least.
Well, Solo gets away with enough money to escape a new ship that he won in Sabacc from Lando, and his life, which is usually all that a Western protagonist escapes with. And I definitely think we'll talk more about the character of the femme fatale when we talk about Star Wars and noir, which is its own subject. But the femme fatale is also a character that appears in Western.
Yeah.
Stealing it from noir, which is the early 1930s noir genre that the Westerns then is like, that is a great character trope. Why don't we just take that and plop her in a saloon?
And I'm sure you could harken that back to even prior to noir, where you have your King Arthur, Morgan Le Fay.
I mean, you can go back to the Romans. The Romans loved the evil stepmother femme fatale trope.
I mean, Eve ate an apple, and that wasn't cool.
Yeah, so if you're looking for the, we talk about the inherent patriarchal sexism present in the character of the femme fatale, and then how it's been reclaimed into an empowering thing over time. Yeah. We'll get to that in another episode. But
yeah, at least Kira, in comic book form, lives on and is a formidable force after that gets into the big leagues, as it were. But
yeah. You can even look at how Fennec Shand in the Book of Boba Fett is even operating in sort of this different femme fatale, where she's also like this prime vizier character as well, where she's not just there to look pretty. In fact, if you're looking pretty is entirely secondary to her job of shooting people very well.
Yes.
But she's still filling that same dangerous woman, dangerous second narrative function. In a way that Asajj Ventress doesn't really, which I appreciate about her character. She's never really a femme fatale, except perhaps in her last appearance in Dark Disciple.
She's purely assassin.
Yeah. She is an assassin who happens to be female rather than her femininity being a key component of her character, which I think is necessary for the character of a femme fatale. But to go back to heists.
Yeah.
So what are some other heists that appear in Star Wars that are sort of have this Western context? Let's see if Connor can find one.
I'm thinking about the various, let's attack the encampment to the Death Star, but that's not exactly a heist. That's more of an assault.
Well, there's the train robbery in the Book of Boba Fett, where it's very Western, where they board a train with their steeds again, which happen to be speeder bikes again, and fight through the corporate goons, steal the cash, and then make a deal at gunpoint with the survivors. Very Western, have that train job.
In The Mandalorian, they have the heist in order to get one of the... Din Djarin, the Mandalorian, teams up with a group of scoundrels, one of them being Bill Burr, the comedian, and they need to, I think, ultimately break out one of their other members?
Yeah, they need to break... So, which is also very Western. We got to break our friend out of prison. So it's the heist prison break, where they have a job, they have a crew, the crew doesn't trust each other. And then, of course, the crew turns on the protagonist, which is always a bad idea.
And what a great way to use one hallway set a multitude of times and still have it work. Because I'm pretty sure it was one hallway set, one cell.
Well, and that is why you set westerns in the desert too. It's like, we don't need any fancy set. Just have Clint Eastwood, sort of squint off into the same sunset a few times, and then play some music over that, and you can see his churning lack of character development deep inside.
Instant production value.
Yeah. Of course, you need Clint Eastwood to be squinting. It's not the same if it's not him squinting.
Right.
And it's not the same if someone other than a Mandalorian in Beskar armor is cutting people down in a hallway to lock them in cells. So as far as other heists that appear, Cad Bane performs a couple of heists and hostage jobs. Has appeared in the Clone Wars. He raids the Jedi Temple to steal a holocron, and then he takes a bunch of senators captive to break break Zero the Hutt out of jail. What other heists do we have? We have the one in Solo that we discussed. And I would say that the theft that happens in Rogue One is more like a war story, less so than it's not really a Western themed heist.
Operation.
Same with breaking into the moon, the forced moon on Endor. That is a war story, not a Western story.
Which we need to add war as a genre in our genre introspection.
Oh, it's on the list.
Yes. So what about the villains, the Black Hats? You mentioned Cad Bane.
The Rider in Black, the quintessential Western villain. So Darth Vader's more a Shogun samurai lord. He's not often filling this Western role because he's not vulnerable enough. Because the enemy, he exudes the right menace, but he's too powerful. The right villain could be killed with a single bullet, but isn't because everyone's so afraid of him. That is the core of the villain in a Western story, often operating as part of the establishment or for their own power.
Adjacent to it, yeah. Like Boba Fett?
Yeah, so Boba Fett in the original trilogy, I think, is definitely operating as sort of this, he's a tool used by the government. He's a bounty hunter. Bounty hunters are very Western inherently.
And so skilled. I love the scene in the Bespin hallway where Luke just moves a little bit and we can see Boba Fett's helmet turn, but he keeps walking. Luke starts to walk out of the hallway, but then boom, there's Boba Fett.
Yeah, immediately ready. The subtle storytelling there is great. And then I think when Boba Fett, in characteristic Western fashion, hangs up his gun to then, I want to go respectable these days. As well as respectable as taking over the throne of a crime boss can be. Yeah. You're becoming part of the establishment. So then one of his old gunslinging companions, Cad Bane, shows up in his black hat and his deadly quick draw to show him the error of his ways.
It's kind of like a representative of what Boba Fett used to be before finding honor and a code and all those things that make one not so applicable to being a Western villain.
Yeah. What other villains do we think you sort of have this direct black hat, black rider, villainous aspect to them in Star Wars?
He's not the man on the horse per se, but Jabba the Hutt is this gangster who has ties to the Western storytelling, where you have much akin to actual crime gangster stories. You have the person who holds the town under its thumb or its slime tail.
Yeah, I definitely think you could see Jabba the Hutt as sort of this back room. He's not going to shoot anybody, but he has people to shoot people for him. But I would say, the villains, antagonists when you get to Star Wars, definitely start to lean more towards, I'd say, the fantastical, the science fiction, the revenge.
The samurai.
Yeah, the samurai movie. But that's why I think the notable ones that do lean into the black hat, black rider aesthetic from a Western are notable.
So yeah, I think when it comes to Western, we covered our hero, our villain, our actions.
The heist, the prison break, the stagecoach job. All those things that appear in a good Western story. You even talked about how speeder bikes often used as a stand-in for steeds. The retelling of the Magnificent Seven.
And to put a cap on it, really, when you stand Star Wars up against all the other science fiction stories, it, does lean heavily towards fantasy, but I think it's the inspiration it takes from Westerns that really help it stand out visually and in terms of storytelling, because science fiction can be a little antiseptic, just kind of clean and polished, and it wasn't until the dirt and grime of a Western entered Star Wars that we started to see that in film afterwards.
Because I think that takes us onto the final cap off of this, as you said, is that as well as being aesthetically grungy, Star Wars is often not afraid, even though it's telling a story of good and evil.
Yeah.
It's idealistically grungy. It's a Western, the protagonist does not always win the day. Or if they do win, it's often with a Pyrrhic victory. Which I think is, we talked about the confrontation between Luke and Vader being very Western themed in Empire Strikes Back, and the heroes lose that movie.
Yeah. They
do not win. Din Djarin, whenever he wins as the Mandalorian, has often lost something. His ship has been damaged. He has barely survived. His child has been taken.
His child ate so many of those ladies' eggs.
Yeah. And there's you have the quintessential train the villager Western showdown again in the Mandalorian when there's the village that's being attacked when they have the single ATST. Yeah. It's also another retelling of the Magnificent Seven, though this time it's the Magnificent Din Djarin.
Yeah.
The Magnificent Mandalorian.
And Cara Dune, who shall not be referred to anymore because of...
No, her character is fine.
I thought they just completely smoothed her over. I still have some merchandise of her because I'm worried that they're not going to sell anymore.
They probably won't sell anymore just because of her actress, but I mean, Gina Carano we don't like, but we're fine with the character of Cara Dune as she appeared in the episodes of The Mandalorian she was in.
Yeah.
I mean, that even has, let's go find the old retired soldier at the bar and convince her to fight with these bandits. Very Western themed there, too.
Which you see in Rebels with the retired clone troopers as well.
Yeah, so the whole coming out of retirement thing. We didn't even talk, Rebels also has some Western influences with a cowboy Jedi, Kanan Jarrus. But yeah, like I said, when Star Wars leans more into its Western themes, it also takes up some of the ideology where sometimes the heroes have to shoot first. They don't always get away with their consciences clean. It requires hard decisions. The world is an unforgiving place.
Yeah.
Well, that is our dive into the Western genre and just a few of the ways that it has borrowed tropes and borrowed storytelling aspects from the genre.
And in the future, not the direct next episode, but later down the line, we'll also discuss how Star Wars lines up with different genres like adventure, horror, your sci-fi, and your fantasy.
And how, sometimes there's a bit of romance, there's a bit of noir, or it can be telling a war story.
And politics. And that is it for today.
Yeah, thank you for listening to us talk about Star Wars, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thank you so much for listening. We've been talking Star Wars. We'll see you sometime soon in a galaxy right here.